It is Tuesday, July the 17th, 2018. This is the Distant Dozen Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff. It is the peasant himself. On today's show, the conclusion of the life and times of Thomas Paine. As you may recall, we last left our hero sailing away from the English docks, taunted by a mob. But he arrived in France to popular acclaim in 1792. In September of that year, soldiers arranged a salutatory battery to fire in his honor as he arrived, and he was presented with the national cockade, the famous red, white, and blue. And his carriage was accompanied by shouts in French, "Long live Thomas Paine! Long live the Revolution!" Now, despite being in France, Thomas Paine would never decently learn his French. I'm sorry to say, but I count myself happy that we have that in common at least. It's my way of apologizing both for the advance and previous horrendous attempts at myself to pronounce French. Anyway, because of this, Paine would naturally gravitate towards the Girondin allies he had prior relationships with in the abolitionist circles and societies of Paris. The ones he had met through Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, most of whom spoke English. He never, as an example, developed a personal relationship with Maximilien Robespierre, despite the two men having a good deal in common. This state of affairs will come to matter a great deal in the future. But in the meantime, the same month that Paine arrived, the National Convention declared unanimously that it was now year one of French liberty, and that, quote, "royalty is from this day abolished in France," end quote. Now, Paine would be one of but 9 people in the whole of France appointed by this convention, through vote, to the committee tasked with the drafting of a new republican constitution. Of this committee, all but 3 men would be consumed by the Reign of Terror. The larger representative body, however, would be consumed at present with but a single question: what to do with Louis XVI? Now, Thomas Paine would write, quote, "It is the office of royalty, rather than the holder of the office, that is fatal in its consequences," end quote. But this would, in the end, be a lonely political position. Now, there was no procedure in place to try a king under French law. The legislature itself would ultimately make up the rules on the fly and act both as jury and judge. This was pointed out by the body itself during debate, and those who believed they were empowered only to draft a republican charter also voiced their objections. But Saint-Just, the youngest deputy elected to the National Convention in 1792 and later called the Angel of Death for his role in the Terror, in his first speech in the chamber, will argue that because to be a king in France was now a crime, Louis should be immediately beheaded without further discussion or any trial. And Thomas Paine made a fateful decision, driven once more by a fearless devotion to principle. He rose to challenge Saint-Just personally in his argument directly. Now, Paine, the poor Englishman who grew up in the shadow of the accumulated methods of torture and execution of his government, and who was opposed to capital punishment on principle, did not argue his principle. He argued instead that executing the king would do nothing but antagonize other world powers, and that to do so without a proper trial would be to expose the Republic of Laws as anything but. Robespierre himself would stride forth to defend Saint-Just's position to the degree that Louis XVI, quote, "declared war on the revolution. He has been defeated, and now it is the duty of the convention to see that revolutionary justice is done. It must be done. Royalty must be abolished," end quote. Robespierre did have a point, In November of that year, the royal family's correspondence would be discovered, and that would expose that while outwardly accepting of first a limited monarchy and then a republic, Louis XVI had in fact been begging the publicly hated Austrians to invade France and restore his throne, among other things. When this was debated in the National Convention, an overwhelming vote for guilt was held, and debates immediately began over the sentence. Paine had risen to argue for exile, but the final tally was 387 to 344 in favor of regicide. On the 19th of January, 1793, Paine went so far as to attempt to reverse this decision. Speaking through a translator, as always, he said much. Among other things, when Jean-Paul Marat challenged that his ballot on this issue should be entirely revoked due to his Quakerism, Paine, who was not a Quaker, replied, quote, "I have the advantage of some experience. It is near 20 years that I have been engaged in the cause of liberty, having contributed something to it in the Revolution of the United States of America. My language has always been that of liberty and of humanity, and I know by experience that nothing so exalts a nation as the union of these two principles under all circumstances. I know that the public mind of France, and particularly that of Paris, has been heated and irritated by the dangers to that which they have been exposed. But could we carry our thoughts into the future, when the dangers are ended and the irritations forgotten, what today seems an act of justice may then appear an act of vengeance? My anxiety for the cause of France has become for the moment concerned for its honor. If, on my return to America, I should employ myself on a history of the French Revolution, I had rather record 1,000 errors dictated by humanity than one inspired by a justice too severe." End quote. Marat would question Paine in English and denounce the interpreter, perhaps attempting to give Thomas Paine an escape hatch. Paine would not take it. He replied in English that he opposed the regicide on moral and political grounds. The king was executed 2 days later, and our principal hero watched as so often happens throughout history, a victorious political faction itself divided further into faction. One of the worst but little discussed episodes of the French Revolution was also erupting in 1793, beginning in earnest that March. Now, the casualties of this uprising are hotly debated to this day, but resisting the efforts of the Parisian revolutionary government to tax and conscript soldiers for the wars with Austria, Prussia, and England, hundreds of thousands of men would take up arms in an episode called the War in the Vendée. Anywhere from 117,000 to 450,000 people would die. Weigh this against the less than 17,000 death sentences of the terror in France, for example. Paine's committee draft of a constitution, stacked with previously powerful Girondins opposed to the now dominant Robespierreites, was roundly voted down, and by April menacing words began to be uttered to his associates, inspired in part by suspicions surrounding Paine's relationship with the American minister to the French, Gouverneur Morris. In June, delegates arrived, stating that Paine, among others, had lost their confidence in Calais, the first step to getting his credentials revoked. Now, throughout all this, Paine might still have kept his freedom, despite having taken an unpopular stand against the regicide and even refusing to stop bringing it up, "Please, Mr. American," and even with the political climate turning decidedly against him and anyone he was associated with. This critical error was yet to occur, and did occur, when Paine, fast becoming one of the few Americans of any stature left in France, wrote a letter. This letter was addressed to the President of the Committee of Public Safety, and was an attempt to obtain aid for some American ships being detained by France over the war with England. In it, Paine reveals his understanding of that American minister to the French, his one-time friend Gouverneur Morris. Basically, Paine calls Morris out for being badly disposed towards the French government, to the Americans being detained, and to Paine, and encourages his recall. Now, Morris already suspected Paine of delivering this advice before, and we know now through letters that Morris suggested to the French government that Paine was seditious and dangerous. A foreign-born Englishman, don't you know? And so Paine was caught up in the purge of the National Convention, a state of affairs Morris admitted that he intended to create. Now, additional arrests were stalled for a time, but by October 1793, mass trials of former deputies began, and nearly all of Paine's allies and friends were either imprisoned, dead, or fled. As humans so often do, he turned to the bottle for a time. But Thomas Paine, man of letters, was not quite finished with this world. The Age of Reason, the last great work of his life, will contain the strivings of a man too clever by far for the arguments of Christians to nonetheless find some deeper meaning in the existence of man. It was not enough for Paine to argue that each citizen had political rights and social rights. He wanted those same people to escape the trappings of superstition and corruption. His religion, as such, was called Deism, and he did not found it so much as attempt to become its St. Paul, if you will. Now, briefly and broadly, Deism's key doctrines were belief in a supreme but non-active creator, that human reason is this creator's creation, that to employ reason, live virtuously, and show repentance is how one should worship this being. To varying degrees, deists would suggest that figures such as Jesus of Nazareth, the Buddha, Socrates, and Muhammad each were attempting to turn their society's corrupt religion back to the natural state of deism. Sunshine and flowers, right? Well, The Age of Reason, published in 3 parts in 1794, 95, and 1807, is not generally remembered for this project. Instead, it would ruin Paine's reputation in America in time, though it achieved bestseller status first, of course. Under the backdrop of radical de-Christianization in revolutionary France and deist celebrations like the Festival of the Supreme Being, Paine attempted to both tear down the old and build up the new. He shared with most Enlightenment deists a fear that a loss of faith in God led people away from virtue and morality, however harmful the institutions of church and the world, and wanted to give others the same spiritual ballast he himself cultivated in this age of cataclysmic change. But as I alluded earlier, it will be remembered far more for its tearing down than building up. And it is this tearing down that his enemies will object to, among other things about Paine. As though, near as I can tell, Paine had the right of it. In The Age of Reason, Paine rejects revelation as a method of obtaining knowledge, argues that the true Bible of deism was all creation itself. He pokes holes all through the Bible, shames priests for their lust for power, and spits at the church's opposition to scientific investigation. Paine admits that he hopes for an afterlife, but opposed the use of its promise to control a population, and marveled at the near constant warfare among the peoples of Europe, all of whom followed the Prince of Peace. Viewed as a radical work, both when it was published and for years to come, its arguments were actually incredibly common among the elite. Only now they were mass-produced in that ever-popular plain style Paine was famous for. With a zeal typical of his signature style, he writes, quote, "Of all the systems of religion that ever were invented, there is no more derogatory to the Almighty, more unedifying to man, more repugnant to reason, more contradictory to itself than this thing called Christianity. Too absurd for belief, too impossible to convince, too inconsistent for practice, it renders the heart torpid, or produces only atheists or fanatics. As an engine of power, it serves the purpose of despotism, and as a means of wealth, the avarice of priests, but so far as respects the good of man in general, it leads to nothing, here or hereafter." End quote. Now, large-scale abandonment of biblical literalism would, in time, cause Paine's ideas and arguments to spread, decades after his death, naturally, as Paine was so often ahead of everyone else. It would be, The Age of Reason that is, the last work of Paine's that he himself would edit. On the 27th of December, according to our calendar, 1793, an order was issued by the French Committee of General Surety and Surveillance. It read, quote, "To the deputies, the committee resolves that the persons named Thomas Paine and Anacharsis Clootz, formerly deputies to the National Convention, be arrested and imprisoned as a measure of general surety, that an examination be made of their papers, and those found suspicious put under seal and brought to the Committee of General Surety. Citizens Jean-Baptiste Martin and Lamy, bearers of the present decree, are empowered to execute it, for which they ask the help of the civil authorities and, if need be, the army." End quote. Paine managed to trick the policeman who woke him up the next morning into letting him hand part of the Age of Reason out for publication, and he was incarcerated at the Luxembourg prison. It was far from one of the worst prisons in France one could be thrown into, and was filled with some of the better regarded political prisoners of the regime, though it did share all prisons of that time's predilection for infection and disease. On January the 20th, 18 Americans approached the French government to ask for Paine's release. Now, twice before, they had tried this with other Americans and received yes for an answer. But this time, the National Convention explained, quote, "Thomas Paine is a native of England. This is undoubtedly enough to apply to him the measures of security prescribed by the revolutionary laws. It may be added, citizens, that if Thomas Paine has been an apostle of liberty, if he has powerfully understood that which has regenerated France, he has regarded the system only in accordance with the illusions with which the false friends of our revolution have invested it. You must with us deplore an error little reconcilable with the principles admired in the justly esteemed works of this Republican author." End quote. Paine himself was busy begging the American minister, our old friend Gouverneur Morris, to please help him get out of prison. Now, Morris would tell his boss, Thomas Jefferson, and his boss's boss, President Washington, that he would strenuously argue that Paine was an American citizen and should be released. He was lying. The French had power over him because Thomas Paine was now French, and French law required the imprisonment of this suspicious foreigner during wartime. It makes no sense, but it is this understanding Morris and the government would both reach. Paine would lose contact with Morris altogether after time, and indeed the entire world, and was forced to remain in prison with no tangible hope of release. Paine grew ill, and as he had years before on his first voyage across the Atlantic, he developed typhus. He was moved to a larger room with 3 Belgians, Charles Bastini and Michael Robbins of Louvain, and Joseph Van Huel of Bruges. I did my best with your names, and thank you very much, gentlemen, for nursing Paine on the doorstep of death. Documentary evidence confirms that on July the 24th, 1794, Paine was scheduled for execution. Indeed, his entire cell was scheduled to be executed together. A prison trustee came by to Paine's cell to mark in chalk the number 4. That was the number of heads from that cell scheduled to roll. Now, his door was open to allow air to circulate for the sick Paine, and when the door was closed, the 4 was not visible, and a very temporary stay of execution was granted to Paine and his cellmates. It may have been dumb luck entirely, or arranged by someone highly placed through argument or bribe. But whatever the case, by the 28th, it was Robespierre and his allies themselves that were being executed, and his life was saved. Now, Paine somewhat justifiably thought that the political upheaval outside the prison would mean his release from inside the prison, but it took the arrival of the future 5th President of the United States, James Monroe, to arrive. Having asked for him to be recalled 3 times, the French government finally sent Morris packing. Now, Monroe, genuinely shocked that Thomas Paine was in prison and nothing had been done about it, immediately began seeking his release, which occurred November 6, 1794, after 10 months and 9 days in prison. Paine himself would never be the same. He would suffer from the after effects of this bout of typhus, gout, and neurological illness for the rest of his life. And though he kept his wits about him, In the last 6 months, he was particularly bad. Now, he would eventually return to America, where once his ballot would be refused for being a Frenchman. And he would bitterly and publicly turn on George Washington, the man he had so passionately defended at the start of his revolutionary career. He felt betrayed and abandoned by his country, including Washington personally, while imprisoned. He will lambaste Washington's generalship during the Revolution and paint him as an overrated wannabe King of America, and this, along with Age of Reason, will help to permanently destroy his reputation in the minds of many Americans. Near the end of his life, an enterprising Christian doctor looking over Paine will opportunistically ask if Paine wished to believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He refused. He died on June the 8th, 1809, and was buried on the farm in New Rochelle that the state of New York had given him so many years before. Less than a dozen people attended his funeral. Included were 2 free black men present for the interment of one of the United States' first abolitionists. Mademoiselle Marguerite de Bonneville and her 2 sons, Benjamin and Thomas, were also there. Refugees from Napoleonic France that Paine came to informally adopt as a family. It was to them he left the bulk of his estate, and he did not die penniless, but left behind the equivalent of about $1 million today. The Mademoiselle writes, "The interment was a scene to affect and to wound any sensible heart. Contemplating who it was, what man it was that we were committing to an obscure grave on an open and disregarded bit of land, I could not help feeling most acutely. Before the earth was thrown down upon the coffin, I, placing myself at the east end of the grave, said to my son Benjamin, 'Stand you there at the other end, as a witness for grateful America.' Looking round me and beholding the small group of spectators, I exclaimed, as the earth tumbled into the grave, 'Oh, Mr. Paine, my son stands here as testimony of the gratitude of America, and I for France.' This was the funeral ceremony of this great politician and philosopher." End quote. So, here we stand, having watched Thomas Paine rise from the bottom of society, soar brilliantly, and then fall again. What of it? His detractors say and will say that his vanity, his stubbornness, his fearlessness bordering on folly, his grudge-holding got him what he deserved, a lonely funeral. A great man who gave us the world's first modern republic, perhaps, but an anti-theist and personally irresponsible man at home, who hid his failures as a man behind his politics. Such words are not uncommon today. Record levels of inequality on paper can be observed in real life with great frequency, as the comfortable watch the next generation fail to establish a decent life for themselves. Thomas Paine was ridiculed for his failures to make his own way in the world, and all manner of attack over this was employed. Is this so different when a home-owning parent in middle age says similar to their overeducated and underemployed children? This happens daily in America and across the world. Paine didn't have what it took to be a successful, prosperous, and happy cog in the machine of his day. He forged his own path, and through a combination of amazing talent, timing, and luck, he succeeded, Horatio Alger style, before Horatio Alger even existed. But Paine was nothing if not thoughtful in his politics, and he did not develop any hyper-individualist tendencies in his economic thought due to this success. I think he grasped intuitively that his path to world-famous author would never be replicable for the vast majority of people working in the world. And he began to imagine a new way forward, to imagine a world where all are fed, clothed, sheltered, and educated, because the people themselves will it so. And for all the great leaps forward in human thought during the Enlightenment age, few of his peers, if any, will ever come this close to his forward thinking. the ballot box Americans are gradually losing its access to today. Its guarantee was vintage Paine. The representation of land and not people, the distortion through the institution of the U.S. Senate and the ratio of gerrymandering of political power of the people. Paine was familiar with the rotten boroughs of his day. Even universal health care in the U.S. is considered an unrealistic dream among some moderates and all conservatives. Truly free and public education, a ridiculous fantasy. Universal family allowances or public incomes, a crazy leftist pipe dream. Thomas Paine was for all of this in eloquent detail centuries ago. Don't take my word for it. How about the Right Honourable Michael Mackintosh Foote, the one-time leader of the British Labour Party of the late 70s and early 80s? He would say, quote, international arbitration, family allowances, maternity benefits, free education, prison reform, full employment, much of the future offered by the British Labour Party was previously on offer, in better English, from Thomas Paine. End quote. Couldn't have put it better myself. Thanks for joining me. The show will be back next time with more explicitly political subjects related to current events. But until then, stay dissident, serfs.